What's new from Apple? And what can Aussies expect from electric vehicles in 2023? Hey there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalist to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and once again, I'm not joined by Alex Kidman, a man who is maxing out his long service leave. But thankfully, there's plenty to talk about this week, so there's no danger of a supply chain special. That'll have to wait until another time. I'm joined by a longtime friend of the show. It's Jen Dudley-Nicholson, who writes about the future of transport for Australian Associated Press. Jen, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much.
So, future of transport, hey? Where's my flying car?
It is the same place as my flying car and my freaking hoverboard.
What's going on here? Like the thing is that I think about who would it be that was trying to make, if someone was trying to build a flying car today, it would be Elon Musk, wouldn't it? How far would we trust a flying car from Elon Musk?
I'd want somebody else to get in it first. And that's how I feel, to be fair, about all flying cars. Like I'm fully on board with them in theory, but I'm not actually on board with them in person.
Fair enough. So flying cars might still probably for the best be a few years away, but there's plenty to talk about right now. 2023 is shaping up as the year of EVs in Australia. But first, Apple surprised us this week and dropped a bundle of new gear. Jen, what did we see from Apple and what do you reckon is worth getting excited about?
Yeah, well, it depends what you're after, but there was a lot. There was a lot of computers, and so all of those sort of previews that we saw of 10% off Macs over the past couple of months, that was all for a good reason because all of a sudden some of the Macs have got speedier insides, and we also saw the return of an old favorite, or something that actually some people had called a dud for Apple, which is kind of a rare thing.
Oh, okay. Maybe we should dive into that first and then come into the Macs. What was Apple's dud and what have they done about it?
Well, I didn't necessarily think it was a dud, but that was the overwhelming sentiment because it didn't sell all of the things that Apple normally sells. So it's the HomePod, and not just like the mini HomePod, but the OG HomePod, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
quite a large smart speaker. Even in the realms of like other smart speakers as well, it was sizable. It was
Hefty.
something that you could really put your lunch in. And then you tried to pick it up and realize I'm not going to eat that thing. So they re-brought out the massive original HomePod, the HomePod 2 as it's now called. So very original. Um, and hopefully they've increased the smarts in it. So from what I've seen so far, Apple is saying that it has similar, though they didn't say better, audio quality this time round. It actually has 2 fewer tweeters than it did in the past. But the sound quality was always great in this thing.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what it was designed for. It was a smart speaker, but really it kind of really focused on the quality of the audio that was coming through it. But the problem was that some of its smarts weren't as smart as they should be. So hopefully that's what's been addressed this time round. And Apple is promising that, it will respond to more queries. It will, even if you've got Android, even though that'll make it difficult to set up, you should be able to beam Spotify songs to it this time. The issue that I had with the original HomePod was that it wouldn't let me cancel any ongoing alarms I had. So hopefully that's been addressed because resetting all of that so it didn't wake you up at all times of the day because you once had to get up at 5 a.m. or
Yeah.
3 a.m. in the case of Apple, that was super annoying.
Yeah.
So hopefully they've addressed some of that stuff and it can come back. It's also a bit cheaper, I should mention. So it's $479, which still puts it in the realms of quite an expensive purchase. So it really depends on what you're going to use it for.
It kind of looked like the big tech players had given up on the big speakers because Apple gave up on their HomePod for their HomePod Mini. Google had the big like Sonos S5 rip-off, but we can't say that for legal purposes. Like the big mama again, and they kind of gave up on that and went for the little Mini. Amazon's got a really big spread of speakers, but still tends to focus on the lower end. Why do you think that they were leaning towards the small speakers and starting to phase out those big ones?
I think as a lot of them, for some of the companies, are actually loss leaders. So
Mm,
if you put out this really cheap, accessible speaker, it gets people into the market and people sort of having a think about talking to random items within their phone and having them within their home and having them respond. Also, it's interesting the paths that they've taken as well, because a lot of the Google and Amazon speakers have gone with screens as well. So they've gone with a different style, and it makes complete sense for those companies because they're also selling you on their services as well. Whereas Apple, it's slightly different. They'd probably like to sell you on Apple Music, which is potentially why they're going more down the audio path. Um, and also, Apple has a bit of a challenge in there because they're really promoting themselves as a company that can keep your privacy, and so as a
mm.
result of that, they can't put as much stuff into their as many personal replies in particular into their speakers. It's not supposed to know who you are. It's got this anonymous, very large Apple ID number associated with you rather than just, Jen. And so it's got some a lot more challenges. So it's interesting to see a different company taking a completely different path, though.
Because that was always one of the frustrations when you had the three big players came out. So you could put the Amazon speaker, the Google speaker, and the Apple speaker, and we'll try not to name check the how to wake them up for those who are
To set
listening at
them all
home.
off.
I think it's all happened to us on live radio.
It's true.
But the Apple one is just it's not as integrated and it's not as capable of answering your questions and doing as many things. Do you think that Siri's getting better at that?
I really hope so. Also, you just name check them.
But I
But
didn't say hey.
okay, good. As long as we keep them separate. It's not, and especially if you're asking about, what's on my calendar and those sorts of things, then
Yeah.
there's extra kind of checks and balances that you have to go through, and potentially that's going to save you some embarrassment. So that's a good thing, and maybe not as much of your data is getting, sucked up and sent to Facebook and whatever whoever's advertising that week. So that's a good thing, but it does present a challenge. And so it really depends which type of speaker, which company has produced the speaker, as to what results you get. And I've noticed that some of my Amazon speakers still think they live in America, and that's very unhelpful. And then some Google speakers, they won't produce as many good YouTube results, which seems ridiculous. And
Hmm.
so you kind of have to learn all of their different quirks to work out which one is going to suit you best.
That whole thing about the speakers thinking they're living in another country, that might be a tech journo problem because I had that problem with a couple of things and it turned out there was some setting I'd changed in my Amazon account somewhere to try and trick it into thinking I was in America. And in the end, I had to give up and create a whole new Australian account because I couldn't get the Amazon speakers to think they were in Australia.
Yeah, that's a possible one. And also, at least it stopped talking to me in Fahrenheit because I have no idea what Fahrenheit is. Like, apart from in the book world, I've just got no
Yeah.
idea.
So also you said we saw a range of new Macs. Now the Apple's taken the M2 to the next level.
Well, to the next computer, yeah. So we've seen the M2 Pro and the M2 Max enter the world of MacBooks and sort of the 14 and the 16-inch MacBooks. And these are expensive, by the way. If you're going to purchase one of these, then you're definitely going to have your credit card out, and it's going to have nothing else on it. So we're talking about potentially up to was it $5,000, $6,000 for some of these computers. This is not something you purchase on a whim, but if you're going to be editing a lot of video or doing some really intense photo editing, then potentially it's worth it for people.
So this is the M2. So this is the second generation of Apple's own silicon after they stopped using Intel's chips. What are the big selling points with the M2? So we already had the original M2, and now we've seen the M2 Pro and the M2 Max, which is kind of copied the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. What are they crowing about here that's worth having with the M2 Pro and Max?
From what I've seen so far, they seem to be really doubling down on this idea that it'll speed up graphical performance.
Hmm.
And so again, if you're editing video, if you're editing big photos, if you're doing really intensive tasks, then that is what this is for. And so people who have multimedia as part of their role, this will make potentially their lives easier, according to Apple.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see computers kind of marketed on that point. I know when the M1 first came out, we started talking a lot about battery life, whereas now it's very much like this is not going to touch your battery necessarily. This is about what you can do when the computer is actually on.
Hmm. I did. They are saying that the biggest MacBook Pro offers a battery life now of 22 hours, which apparently is the best battery life ever for a Mac. So there is still a bit of a battery story there, but as you say, I think it's more the grunt. From what I saw comparing the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, the graphics grunt was the only difference. The CPU in them is the same. It's the GPU. So if you're a journalist like me who's just putting out words and audio and they're not going to use that GPU, then the Max would be a total waste of money for me. I would never actually break into the Max bit of it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I don't think you necessarily need to ditch your M1 Mac if that's what you're doing
I'm
essentially.
very
I
glad
think
to
that
hear
this
that
is
because I spent a lot of
yes.
money on it not so long ago.
Yes, please do not throw it away. Do not love it any less because it is still
Hmm.
a very useful machine. This is really about those intensive graphics. And it's interesting though. Like you do have to spend a lot of money to unlock that kind of next level of graphics as well. Particularly for these two machines, which are the most powerful of the laptops.
Yeah. Have we seen a MacBook Pro with a touch screen? They keep talking about them.
Well, they're talking about them more because the rumors started even before this announcement came out. The rumors started that Apple is finally having a rethink, and they're going to talk about actually putting touchscreens, which has long been kind of the line in the sand that they've drawn. No,
Hmm.
if you want a powerful iPad, that's fine. You can have a touchscreen, and after that, I'm sorry, no, do not put your fingers all over an iMac or a MacBook Pro. And so it would be interesting to see them do that. I don't necessarily know if there's a giant call out there for them to do that. I mean, some people have said yes, but touching the screen of a laptop is still a bit weird. Maybe somebody's kids just got hold of one of their computers and started touching it because that's what kids do.
I would imagine that it would have to come with a new version of Mac OS because that was the problem with the early versions of Windows on touchscreen devices. Windows was just not designed for touchscreens and it was horrible. And it wasn't till they got to about Windows 8 and they started to add that separate tablet style kind of menu, which was a bit hit and miss, but is now actually pretty good if that's your thing.
Hmm.
They'd need to do something different with a Mac, wouldn't they? They couldn't just take normal Mac OS that we're used to and say, hey, you can touch it now.
I think it would be strange if they did. However, I mean, if anyone's equipped to deal with touchscreen devices, it's Apple. They've
Mm,
they've got a couple of OSs that do that sort of
yeah,
thing. But I think there would need to be more of a crossover between iOS and macOS for sure.
yeah. Which is what I'm worried about. They're trying to turn my MacBook into a very expensive iPad. I think that freaks some people out.
With an excellent keyboard.
With an excellent keyboard, yes. And the Mac Mini, which doesn't tend to get as much love these days, is also scoring an M2 Pro or Max or M something.
Yes, an M something. Yes, I believe it doesn't get the maximum M2. So
Okay,
it has the M2 and the M2 Pro, but not the M2 Max, as I understand it.
so there's no Mini
Um,
Max.
there is no mini. I think once you get up to the Max flavors, then you have to go up to the Max Studio, which is a whole different price bracket
Oh,
essentially.
yeah.
And so that's one of the things that Apple is just kind of keeping to themselves. But this upgrade has still been pretty powerful for the Mac Mini, as I understand it.
So Apple's not the only one bringing out new gear in 2023. We're expecting to see a lot in terms of new electric vehicles, aren't we?
A lot. Yeah, absolutely. So, Australia's kind of struggled to actually get access to vehicles, but there's quite a few that are slated to come to Australia this year, which is making a lot of people very happy, I think. We've seen a lot of Tesla in the country, and if you're doing what I'm doing and paying everyone 20 cents every time they get to see one, kind of like a punch bug situation for like there was for Volkswagens back in the day, you're probably spending a lot of money all of a sudden because the numbers have almost doubled in Australia over the past year. But this year, I think there's potential for them to at least double again because we've got so many more vehicle makers who are lining up to finally bring their wares to Australia.
And is it one of the things I've noticed? It tends to be the high end luxury brands, but we're getting more affordable cars, I guess.
Yeah, I think we're getting a bit of all of them. So
Yeah.
so absolutely, electric vehicles have traditionally cost more than petrol cars, and I don't think that's going to change completely. But we're going to see more at that kind of entry level, as you say,
Yeah.
and a lot of the Chinese manufacturers, that's what they're focusing on, which is fantastic. So we'll see more from MG and more from BYD. They're both lining up with multiple offerings that are coming to Australia quite soon too. So they're talking about the first half of the year for some of these things. There's a couple of the European brands as well, like Capra Born has just announced that they've had I think 350 sales for their electric hatchback within 4 weeks, which seems like a lot when they cost all around $60,000 and more.
Mm.
So yeah, we'll definitely see some more electric hatchbacks this year and smaller, cheaper models. I think that will probably break the price barrier that we've seen, which has been around that $50,000 mark. I think it'll slip down potentially by $10,000 this year, which puts it in the reach of a lot more people.
Yeah. So one of the things that people always think about with electric cars is the concerns about the different charging options, but we're seeing a lot more in terms of where you might be able to charge and how you might be able to charge as well. Yes.
Absolutely. There's so many different projects going on in charging that it's kind of hard to keep track of them all.
Mm.
But that's a great thing. I would point out that over the Christmas holidays as well, we saw a record number of vehicles trying to charge, and that's because there were the most that we've ever had in Australia out there, and people were actually taking them on road trips for the first time. So we'll see a lot more like an expansion of those sort of traditional chargers. We'll see more Tesla superchargers, which we've seen a lot of in Australia, but we'll also see some more unusual ones. So there's been some trials of um, basically pole mounted chargers. We've seen the first ones down at Newcastle for that. And essentially, they'll be around, regular places that you would park, and they'll just be on the side of a power pole, and you'll be able to plug your car into that. We've also seen an expansion of the charges from EV networks and ChargeFox, and that will continue, especially around shopping centres and high traffic areas. Then we've seen different states that have put in money in order to co fund charges with folks like NRMA. And then on top of all of that, some of the local councils are actually making some efforts to let people charge by their cars, their cars on the footpaths. And so, if you've got an apartment, for example, and you can't necessarily put in a charger into the basement, then some of these platforms will essentially let you charge on the street where you normally park your car, which
Yeah.
is fantastic because that does cut some people out of the market, and that's something that Australia will need to address in order to get this transition happening.
So I guess one of the real changes in the way that we look at fueling and refueling our cars is that petrol stations are somewhere where you stop for 10 minutes, get what you need, and get out of the way and let the next person in. Um, we can't just convert petrol stations into charging stations because petrol stations aren't really designed for long stays. Is that why we're doing more of charging where you park? And then, if that's so, what will happen to the petrol station model? Can they adapt and move with the times, or is it just that whole concept not going to work?
It's really interesting because I've talked to some people who've said like different things and have completely different perspectives on this. So it's going to be interesting. It's not necessarily like the video shop. We're not necessarily going to see all petrol stations die. I
Mm.
think what they've seen in places like Norway, where they have a much higher take up, we're talking about 60% of vehicles being electric. What we've seen is most people charge at home because they can. And you can plug these vehicles straight into a wall point in your garage, and that's it. And their range, actually, I would point out too, like some of the range of these cars, they go for up to 500 kilometers on a single charge. And if you think about how much you actually cover, how many kilometers you actually drive, potentially that'll do you at least for a week. It would certainly,
That'd do
yeah,
me for a
last.
few weeks. We don't do a lot of driving.
Well, exactly. And so
Yeah.
if you're driving around the city, then it's not such an issue. There'll also be a lot of charges that people will use at places like shopping centers and their workplaces, because if you can, you're going to be spending time there anyway. It makes sense for you to just plug in and charge up there while you're doing something else. But where it really comes into question is with road trips, which is what we've seen over this Christmas period as well. So there is a case to be made, according to some people, to upgrade petrol stations because they're already along freeways, they're already along sort of places where the cars are, because that makes a certain sense. Somebody also pointed out to me that a lot of these petrol stations also have provision to add a car wash, and then they haven't done that. So they've actually got extra electrical infrastructure there that could be
Oh, okay.
potentially used for these things. And we've seen companies like BP and Ampol actually commit to rolling out some of these. But as you say, petrol stations are smelly. They're kind of gross most of the time. They serve, I don't want to brand all of them, but pretty disgusting food. So there's been some interesting concepts put together around what the future petrol station would look like. And potentially it has a library and a cafe, and it doesn't serve just food that is fried. And it makes it inviting for you to spend half an hour in there eating some food, staring at your phone, staring into space. There's also been some attention paid to where you'd put these charges as well, though. So even if it's not necessarily at a petrol station, if it's at a place with a really nice cafe and a small town that wants to attract tourists, then it makes sense as well, because you've got potentially a captive market for at least half an hour to 40 minutes while people are fueling up. And, they could get out of their cars and stretch their legs and feel refreshed and go and spend some money in local townships that might not otherwise see it. I've seen some bowling clubs, for example, bowls clubs, put together funding applications for these electric vehicle chargers, simply because then they would get customers in there. And it is the case that folks who are making these long road trips will stop off at various locations to charge up. They'll make a beeline for them when they see them on the map. So potentially it could solve two issues of local tourism and charging up vehicles.
You were talking about charging at home. One of the things that gets talked about a little bit, but still seems to be very up in the air, is this idea of vehicle to grid. So, not just that you can put power into your car, but then you can use your car almost like a portable battery to pull it back out into your house when you need it.
Mhm.
Where are we at with that in Australia?
It is still very early stages, not just in Australia but overseas as well.
Yeah.
We've seen a couple of cases of it being used, and it's definitely being trialed. I've seen quite a few in South Australia, and ChargeFox has brought out some equipment to let people do that. But one of the issues is that some of the cars will allow it, but most of the cars don't have vehicle to grid ready. Some of the energy suppliers as well aren't ready for that sort of commitment as well. It is a really interesting solution though, because this is the idea that, you've got solar panels on your roof, you're charging during the day when the electricity is essentially free for you. Your car is becoming a solar sponge, and then it can connect to your house to run your house. And in vehicle to grid, it can connect back to the grid to actually basically be used as a backup generator for the rest of the electricity network. It has a huge amount of potential, but at the moment, we're not seeing a lot of it being used.
I think part of the thing as well is that there's not one standard in terms of the connector that you can use to connect your car to the house and the infrastructure. So you could get it for one car, but then when you get your next electric car, it may not match.
That's right, and so far, I think most of the vehicle to grid trials that we've seen have been with the Nissan Leaf vehicles,
Yeah.
because they supported it and have done very early. But we haven't seen that with Teslas, for example, which are by far and away the most popular electric cars in Australia. So it's going to depend on a whole number of things. Like a lot of this, there's a lot of different moving pieces, and we're not necessarily ready for it just yet.
Is that because Tesla wants to sell you a Powerwall battery? So they don't want you to use your car instead?
I think that they'd love to sell you a Powerwall. I can't say whether that's because of that or not, but
Yeah.
certainly there's a conspiracy theory to be had.
I'm trying to remember, is it the Ford F-150 Lightning, I think, is the new electronic the new EV in the US, and that does I don't know about so much vehicle to grid, but vehicle to house, because one of the selling points is that, and if a hurricane wipes everything out, you run your house off this thing for a few days. Is that a model that's coming here? And are they talking about the kind of stuff here about how the house can make you a bit more resilient in terms of in face of a natural disaster? Not the house, sorry, the car can.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that idea of the solar sponge as well, because it could basically do the work of something of a power wall in your house.
Mm,
Essentially, it's an extra battery where you can use, because potentially you can run your house for 2 to 3 days off the battery in your car. And I mean, some people I've heard from some critics against it who say things like, well, that just puts extra pressure on the car. But I was talking to a bloke from Nissan who was saying, well, actually, driving is an enormous stress. Like, you've got to have enormous torque that comes out of that battery. Driving your vehicle is the most stressful time that car's battery will ever go through. So actually, running your house isn't that stressful for it. It's a pretty consistent supply that it's being asked to provide.
yeah.
So definitely, I think that has a lot more potential, and we'll probably see that before we see vehicle to grid. And just having that as a backup would be nice to save some frozen goods, frankly.
So it's not like when we say EVs, we're talking about electric cars, but the V stands for vehicles. What else are we seeing in Australia in terms of electric vehicles?
There is a lot, and I've been really surprised by this coming onto this in the past few months. So, recently I wrote about an electric ferry because one is actually being created in Tasmania, and it's going to be the largest. It's like 130 meters long. It's going to go between Argentina and Uruguay. So that's a real thing. Batteries are going to are going to weigh 400 ton, but it's actually replacing 500 tons of fuel equipment.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. We've seen a lot of electric bus talk as well. And I think that a lot people will, and pardon the pun, get on board with electric buses as well, because number one, they won't cost that much for people who are actually passengers. Number two, they're going to be so much more quiet. And number three, they're not going to smell as bad, because if you've been on a bus, you wouldn't stand behind one. They're generally pretty disgusting. They run diesel or gas. These electric buses are much quieter, much smoother to ride in, and they make a lot of sense. And so, 4 states and territories have committed to rolling those out within certain timeframes. Some are more ahead of them than others, but they're actually being produced in Australia as well, which has been fascinating to see that we can do that even though we don't have our own local car market anymore.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. So there's quite a few bus manufacturers around the place. I've heard of companies in Western Australia, Brisbane, the Gold Coast, Sydney, Melbourne, who are all creating electric buses.
Because when you
Um,
think about it, an electric bus makes perfect sense because you know exactly how it's going to be used and where it's going to be at any given time. So in terms of it's never going to run out of charge because it's never going to take an unexpected trip.
No, exactly. And a lot of these buses, they go out during peak times.
Mm,
And so you can potentially charge them from solar power during the day, and then they go out back, in the peak seasons when the sun is going down.
yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense. They can charge overnight as well. They do cost more than diesel buses do. And also you have to have the infrastructure in place. But ultimately, as a long-term investment, then they're much smarter, essentially. And then in addition to all of that, we've seen kind of personal mobility devices. So e-bikes and e-scooters are still taking over Australia. I like that e-scooters came out of Brisbane just because I'm a local girl. But now we're seeing a lot more. There's still some inconsistent laws about privately owned scooters, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, which makes the whole thing kind of ridiculous.
I don't
But
understand what's the difference in the laws.
So, for example, in Melbourne, they ran a trial of e-scooters and finally allowed them on roads, but only the ones that you can rent. You can't actually. It's illegal to use your own electric scooter in Melbourne on publicly in public areas, essentially. Which all of the laws and all of the research rather says that is actually safer, because people who own e-scooters typically wear helmets more often because they're prepared for it, and they don't want to lose their e-scooters. They know exactly the locations where they can ride them. They know the laws a bit better, as opposed to someone who's rocked up on a drunken night out and gone, yeah, I'll hop on that thing. Or look at me, I'm Nick Kyrgios. I don't have to wear a helmet, for example. Um, and so it's a really interesting, juxtaposition that they've decided on there, where they will allow some people but not others. But hopefully we'll get past that sometime soon.
So it's interesting what you're saying about Australia's building electric buses. I hadn't heard much about that. You would think that Australia is well positioned to get in on the ground floor here. But you could have said that with solar and a few other things, and we missed our opportunities. Are we seeing signs that Australia is? Well, maybe we've missed the ground floor. Are we seeing signs that Australia's going to get in on the first floor of the EVs revolution, and which bits of it are we going to make the most of?
I would love to say that Australia is ahead of the game and we're doing really well. We're actually playing catch up, and so even New Zealand is ahead of us on this. And so, yes, we've seen in the past year there's been more progress, absolutely, and we've gone from 1.65% of electric cars to more than 3% electric cars in terms of new car sales. But we're comparing ourselves, potentially with even America's. I think it's got 10%. Britain's got, reaching up towards 20% electric vehicles. We're still behind the ball on this, which is interesting because we have so many solar panels, as you mentioned. Like we've got so much available electricity that we could plug into these vehicles and save on huge petrol costs. But there just hasn't been the support for it. We haven't had the laws in place to actually encourage automakers to bring their electric vehicles over here. Now that they're making more of them, it makes sense for them to bring some to Australia as well. We also have a weird relationship with electric utes and with utes in general. So many people in Australia and New Zealand use utes as opposed to the rest of the world, where they don't necessarily love them quite as much. And we haven't seen as many electric utes made. So there's also, in addition to all of that, something called a fuel efficiency standard. So it sounds really boring, but essentially, a fuel efficiency standard says that all automakers have to bring in, across their entire range, vehicles that only produce a certain amount of pollution. And if they produce over that amount, so if they only bring out, utes to Australia, for example, and they're all high polluting utes, then they could potentially risk a fine. So those laws would mean that they're encouraged to bring out more zero emission vehicles, more EVs, more, potential electric hatchbacks and SUVs and all sorts of vehicles. But because we don't have that in place yet, we haven't seen as many come to Australia, and we haven't seen prices decline as a result. Potentially, we could see one of those come into Australia this year because we had a consultation paper go out at the end of last year. It finished up at the end of October for Halloween, of all times. And potentially the reaction to that this year will dictate how we go forward as a country using electric vehicles.
I saw the International Council on Clean Transport said that if Australia wants to meet its 2050 net zero emission targets, then we need to stop selling new petrol cars by 2035 and have these fuel efficiency standards that you're talking about within the next 2 years. Are you seeing signs that either of those things will happen when they
There
say
are
they should happen?
Yeah, there are signs. And so, as a result of that consultation, I think there was something like more than 500 submissions that were made. So the government has a lot of reading to do on this, and they've made a lot of they've said a lot of things that indicate that they're willing to do that and then bring in this fuel efficiency standard. It's probably worthwhile noting that Australia is one of two OECD countries that doesn't have one, and the other one is Russia. So we're not
We're
necessarily
in great
comparing
company
ourselves
there.
terribly well. Yeah, a little bit awkward on the world stage. And so I think within 2 years, I think we'll definitely see this standard come in, and that will change the market as well. In terms of banning the sale of petrol cars, I think that's going to be a much harder sell for some states. We have seen that only in one territory, and that's the ACT. So, I mean, Canberra's got a bit of a different approach to all of this. They have a Labor Greens government, which is very keen on electric vehicles and has done a lot to promote them. And they also have low interest loans and more incentives to get an electric vehicle. And as a result, they've seen the higher sales in Australia for them. I don't think that the likes of Queensland and New South Wales and the NT and places with wide brown lands and people that they couldn't even necessarily get over the line for daylight savings will be as amenable to banning petrol and diesel cars, I should say, and particularly when that ute issue is still hanging over us. We've seen the first electric ute come into Australia that launched, an LDV launched in November last year, but we haven't seen them in huge numbers yet. We saw an announcement this week where some of them are being converted to electric cars, but that's not necessarily a prospect for a lot of buyers. So I think that there's still a lot of different pieces to that puzzle. In terms of whether we will meet our climate targets without this, probably not. And so someone really needs to, pardon the pun, put the foot on the accelerator.
So, if, for example, Ford turned around and brought the F-150 Lightning to Australia, that would be a big milestone in terms of getting that demographic across the line.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a lot of demand for that as well. I think that there are people who are desperate to buy an electric ute, who could see that it has huge capacity and huge usefulness in certain areas of Australia where you need to haul large amounts of goods over, a long distance. And so I think that it would sell incredibly well, but also they've got to be able to make them as well. There's a lot of demand all around the world for these things. But if I was Ford, I'd be looking at Australia because I think that you would print money.
As you're saying, we've got the raw materials and the resources that we could be getting in further back along the supply chain. We've got a lot of lithium, for example. What are we seeing in terms of, we'll say, making EV batteries here?
We've seen it a bit, and I love that you got supply chains in here. Alex is out the
Yes, I
window, and
got
you're
I
like,
got it in
yes,
there. Yeah.
let's talk supply chains. It makes absolute sense for Australia to be producing batteries for electric vehicles because, as I say, that's huge demand, not just here but overseas. It makes a lot of sense, and so we've seen some more efforts in this regard. There's plans for a giant gigafactory in Geelong.
Mhm.
And there's efforts being made to sound out that eventuality that we've seen happen this week. I think that it makes an awful lot of sense. These are factories that are also potentially going in where car manufacturers used
That's
to
what I was
be in
going to say. That's
Australia.
Geelong is where the big Ford factory was.
Exactly. And so, hopefully we can see this sort of industry recommence. Certainly, there's huge demand for electric cars. It would be nice to see some of them even being made in Australia. I don't know whether we'll get to that point. I know that Tesla's Robin Denham, she mentioned that a little while ago as well. The possibility of bringing manufacturing to Australia. I think that the batteries are probably a more likely prospect, and it would be great to see some of them made in Australia from, natural resources that we have here.
Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks, Jen, for joining us again.
Pleasure.
It's time for me to hit you with the Vertical Hold patented 3 questions of doom. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And the big question at the moment, what's the one thing you'd never give up as a New Year's resolution?
Oh dear. Never is hard, but
Hmm.
I'm not letting my cold hands off caffeine because it's been a really busy year already and it's January, damn it. You can find me online on social media at Jen Dudley on Twitter, and you can also find my work on aapnews.com.au and also across a lot of publications that pick up AAP copy.
Yes, I've seen you in all kinds of places recently.
I did like, I told my husband I was in The Guardian, and he said, "What, you're into gardening?" So we might need to look into some sort of hearing aid there.
And as always, you can find us at verticalhold.com.au or Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, or you can head to the Vertical Hold Facebook page. Thanks everyone for joining in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, tell your enemies about us, help us spread the good word in 2023.